Critique of Western Marxism. Let's take a look at this red
video was
pen
made
video.
possible by the generous support of my patrons. If you would
Finally.
like to join them in helping grow this channel, you can do so at the links in the description
Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. Okay, you stop.
below.
For Karl Marx, theory was never an abstract exercise detached from practice, but a guide to concrete political struggle rooted in material conditions. However, over time, his emphasis on praxis, the unity of theory and revolutionary action, has become a key point of disagreement within the Marxist tradition. Today, nowhere is this tension more sharply expressed than in the debates surrounding Marxism-Leninism and Western Marxism over the political and economic nature of the People's Republic of China. On the one hand, Marxism-Leninism has largely developed among the Global South, which has used this theory as a guide to revolutionary action, and in many cases, has even seen communist parties capture state power. In the imperial core, however, Western Marxism largely remains a creation of the bourgeois academy, rejecting the theory of Marxism-Leninism and the practice of actually existing socialist states. Instead, it seeks to synthesize Marx with Freud, Heidegger, or any number of non-Marxist eclectic thinkers to expand the horizons of Marxist thought beyond Lenin. This leaves it not only poorly equipped to wage socialist struggle, but also renders it incapable of analyzing countries like the People's Republic of China
Deng Xiaomi.
as a historically grounded project of socialist construction. This video therefore attempts to intervene in this gap by arguing that a serious Marxist analysis must return to Marx's original problem of not only interpreting the world, but politically acting to change it. In doing so, we will critically examine the limitations of Western Marxist approaches to actually existing socialism and recenter the question of socialism with Chinese characteristics within a Marxist-Leninist framework.
Throughout the 1980s, actually existing socialism entered a period of profound crisis. In the Soviet Union, Mikhail Gorbachev's reforms, combined with mounting economic, political, and military pressures, culminated in the collapse of the Soviet bloc in 1989 and the illegal dissolution of the USSR in 1991. At the same time, the People's Republic of China faced its own upheavals. The legacy of the Cultural Revolution, the political crisis following the death of Mao Zedong, and the uncertain transition towards market reforms under Chen Yun and Deng Xiaoping. To many observers, these developments signaled not only the failure of socialist states, but the obsolescence of Marxism-Leninism as well.
This sentiment
Another L from Fukuyama.
was expressed in Francis Fukuyama's End of History thesis, which, although analytically weak, gained global prominence by proclaiming the definitive triumph of capitalism in the global class struggle, functioning as capitalism's eulogy for socialism.
How'd that take age, Francis? I mean, he admits it was bunk. It's really interesting because it's like such an important work for like 99% of the most annoying liberals that still operate on the assumption that history has ended. Liberalism won, it's over. Liberalism is permanently the monoculture. And they just refuse to recognize that the guy who said it also now disagrees with the initial thesis.
But this narrative began to unravel after the 2008-2009 global financial crisis, where two things started to become clear. First, the crisis exposed the recklessness of financialized capitalism and the class character of the state's response. As millions of working-class Americans lost their homes, jobs, and their life savings, the very institutions responsible for the collapse were rescued through massive public bailouts, rewarded with bonuses, and retained decisive influence over economic policy. The crisis revealed not only systemic instability, but a profound indifference of ruling elites towards the social consequences of their recklessness.
Second, the crisis highlighted the resilience of the Chinese system. While Western Europe saw its average GDP contract by 5% in 2009, go through a slow recovery process, and then drop another 6% in the first year of the COVID-19 pandemic.
You'd assume that this is good. Turkey's GDP growth rate being at 4%, as though that economic activity translates to, a better economy for the everyday Turkish people. God, the GDP is so ass. As a
China
metric.
maintained roughly 7.5 annual GDP growth until 2019, and then even saw a modest 2% growth throughout 2020. This contrast between these two systems signaled to many that regardless of how China's economic system was labeled, it appeared to possess institutional mechanisms that insulated it from the financial contagion that American finance capital was spreading to the rest of the world.
Turkey's much richer than it was 10 to 20 years ago. Yeah, it doesn't translate to like overall wealth for the average person, though. That was the point I was making.
At the time, however, China remained a contentious case for many on the left, still relatively underdeveloped, marked by environmental degradation, and recognized as the workshop of the world. It did not conform to Western idealized visions of socialism. For those seeking a pure socialism, for now, China's model left much to be desired. For the most part, Western Marxists were dismissive of China. However, there did remain a select number of Marxist-Leninist thinkers in the West who were able to comprehend the socialist logic behind China's reform and opening up. Domenico Lucerdo, for example, recognized in 2010 that China's market
Does fun mean learning? I don't think so. Yes, it does.
reforms were part of a long-term socialist trajectory rather than a capitulation to capitalism.
Since then, China's political and economic system has continued to attract interest and has gained the attention of many foreign observers, sharpening debate around whether or not China is a truly socialist system. The division between Marxist-Leninist and Western Marxist perspectives on China can perhaps be best understood within the framework of the classic debate between the scientific socialism of Marx and Engels and the idealism of various utopian socialists. Vladimir Lenin later identified these utopian tendencies in what he called left-wing communism,
Yuck.
marked by a preference for ideological purity over strategic compromise and concrete analysis. More recently, the great Marxist scholar Michael Parenti described a similar tendency in his remarks on pure socialism. He says that the pure socialists support every revolution except the ones that succeed. When reality proves different and more difficult, some on the left proceed to condemn the real thing and announce that they feel betrayed.
Yeah. Read it in Wheat Bozos. Oh, China's not real communism. China's not real socialism. Cuba's not real socialism. Real socialism has never been implemented.
By this or that revolution. The pure socialists see socialism as an ideal that was tarnished by communist venality, duplicity, and power cravings. The pure socialists oppose the Soviet model, but offer little evidence to demonstrate that other paths could have been taken, that other models of socialism could have taken hold and worked better. Today, this tendency is often referred to as Western Marxism. Western Marxism conforms to this utopian tradition of ultra-left purity fetishism by distancing itself from revolutionary praxis. It frequently reduces Marxism down to a critique of capitalism, while stopping short of offering any type of coherent strategy, institutional model, or policy program for moving beyond it. It offers no examples to emulate, either past or present, no agreed-upon principles, no coherent or tested strategy, just a vague belief in socialism from below and proletarian internationalism.
Sorry, but r/ultra left said that no, there's not even the ultras that say that. That's left comms. Left comms will say the resistance in Palestine is bourgeois in nature, and therefore they refuse to support it. It's a real, how about no nation states ideology? Like the nonsensical position where people will be like, well, don't you think trying to develop an ethnic enclave for the Kurds is inherently reactionary? I thought you didn't want an ethno-state. It's like, okay, well, they're stateless for the most part, you know? What do you want?
They invest all of their hopes in the notion that an as-yet unrealized third way
I've never seen a left com say that. No, I've seen that on
to
Twitter.
socialism will spontaneously emerge at this advanced and decaying stage of monopoly capitalism. Its slogan, neither Washington nor Moscow, now recycled as neither Washington nor Beijing, expresses this retreat from reality very well. Rather than engaging with the real historical processes of building towards a socialist project, they seem to believe that history will somehow deliver a new model capable of transcending both monopoly capitalism and actually existing socialism. In this way, Western Marxism hardly offers anything more than a hollow politics that leads to a dead end in revolutionary praxis.
Western Marxism tends to treat the case against China's market socialism as self-evident. If an economy contains private ownership, wage labor, or market exchange, according to them, it must be capitalist. And therefore,
Literally every liberal does this, by the way. Every liberal that like maybe read a little bit of socialist literature will be like, you say, sweetie, that China is a transitional socialist state, but guess what? They're still private enterprise. Yeah, well, let's do that then. Let's do that. I want that. How about that's a better the way to organize society. Let's just move in that direction then. Yeah, it's capitalism. Let's do Chinese style. Let's do socialism with American characteristics. Let's call it that.
China is capitalist, plain and simple. For Western Marxism, socialism is defined in purely idealist terms, a system of direct worker control over production, political power exercised through direct democracy, the abolition of markets, money, and class relations altogether, a society freed from all forms of exploitation, where it becomes possible to hunt in the morning, fish in the afternoon, rear cattle in the evening, and criticize after dinner. By this standard, the People's Republic of China clearly falls short. However, what Western Marxism tends to overlook is the fact that China did initially strive towards this type of pure socialism during the Maoist era. Throughout the Cultural Revolution from 1966 to 1976, efforts to prioritize ideological transformation often came at the expense of developing the economic base. In the name of egalitarianism, workers and peasants were elevated to positions of authority based on class background rather than technical competence, while experts, technicians, and urban intellectuals were marginalized, leading to widespread inefficiencies that constrain productive development. In fact, economic problems, namely the persistence of poverty, became so acute that the Maoist Gang of Four attempted to redefine socialism as a type of common poverty, declaring that it is better to be poor under socialism than rich under capitalism.
However, addressing the material needs of the people through the level of ideology or consciousness in this way would only go so far until qualitative social and economic transformation became unavoidable and a pivot towards something new became urgently necessary.
The party's pivot away from the Maoist Gang of Four was largely marked by Deng Xiaoping's return to the party and his declaration that socialism is not poverty. Socialism means eliminating poverty. Unless you are developing the forces of production, you cannot say you are building socialism. In fact, Deng Xiaoping repeatedly emphasized that market socialism was necessary to proceed down the
To be rich is to be glorious.
socialist road, and that it did not represent an attempt to abandon socialist ideals altogether. In 1979, he clarified that if we did not adhere to socialism, if we did not adhere to the leadership of the Communist Party, if we did not adhere to Marxism-Leninism and Mao Zedong thought, China would inevitably become chaotic.
He even explicitly rejected Soviet-style de-Stalinization and reiterated his commitment to Mao Zedong thought in the early 1980s.
To be fair, different strokes for different folks. Mao Zedong was seen as like the North Star in every stage of development in Chinese transitional socialism. The reason why is because like even if like Deng Xiaoping's reforms and market liberalization initiatives or marketization initiatives rather were to work, he would also have to really beef up how much he loves Mao Zedong on the other side because of the tremendous amount of reverence that Mao Zedong had. This is a thing that most people don't understand about China or the Chinese. Everyone outside of China in the Western world especially be like, you like Mao Zedong? He was a ruthless murderer. And it's like everyone in China is like, that's the godfather of the modern nation. Like the f are you talking about? It's so funny. Like I can't think of another equivalent where the argument made by the West is he killed so many Chinese. He killed 100 billion Chinese, right? They'll be like, he killed tens of millions of crows and 100 billion Chinese in tow. And it's like, dog, go ask the descendants. Like go ask the Chinese people how they feel about Mao Zedong. Like Americans act as though, like it's not like they don't even say like, oh, Mao Zedong killed other people. He's saying he killed Chinese, right? So why the f is it the Chinese love him so much? At least with de-Stalinization, due to the nature of the excesses during the Stalin period, post World War II period especially, there was at least some enmity internally within the USSR. So there was at least like a reasonable amount of people that were saying like, yeah, de-Stalinization is good. Whereas with Mao Zedong, I mean, they've had the exact opposite effect, where in periods of crisis, or when there's like significant changes taking place in society, they hold extra reverence towards Mao Zedong as though he is the North Star. The more you stray away from Maoist principles or Mao Zedong thought, the more you hype up Mao Zedong, which is exactly what Deng Xiaoping did. Exact opposite of post-Stalin USSR. They overdid the de-Stalinization too, sure.
When he assured that, we will not do to Chairman Mao what Khrushchev did to Stalin.
In 1992, he further explained that planning and market forces are not the essential difference between socialism and capitalism, and that market reform was undertaken not to abandon socialism, but to develop it. The reform and opening up was therefore not a counter-revolution or a betrayal of socialism, but the outcome of trial and error, emerging from earlier failed.
Yep, Jokazai, can you explain Deng without Mao and vice versa? There is no Deng without Mao, and there's no Mao without Deng. Or there is no modern China without both of these figures, rather. There is everything that happened in Chinese development happened in succession. It's the Bao joke. In front of you are 5 dumplings. You eat the first dumpling, and then you eat the second dumpling, and you eat the third dumpling. And on the 4th dumpling, you say, wow, I'm full. Is it the 4th dumpling that made you full? Could you have just rushed to the 4th dumpling and just eaten that and feel full all the same? No, you had to have the dumplings that came before it.
Attempts to create a socialist society completely free from exploitation. After Mao, the Communist Party had determined that earlier attempts to achieve socialism were hindered by the fact that China rested.
Thank you, Biden, for giving us Trump. I mean, there is also truth to that, absolutely. But you also have to remember, yes, this is successive regression happening at the hands of capitalist bourgeois parties. Parties change, but societal or the politics doesn't change at all. So yeah, if we were to look at the real ideological differences with waves rather than one party swapping power over to the other, I would say that the period of changes that took place in America that were incredibly important happened under FDR, and then post FDR all the way until Ronald Reagan. There is a domineering impact of, social democratization, social democracy in America in the way that you experience it in like Europe, close to that, right? Obviously, never to that same degree. There were plenty of parts of the welfare apparatus that were still unbelievably decentralized. But like the New Deal Democrats dominated American politics post-New Deal. Until Carter, yes. Carter is the turning point towards neoliberalism. But Reagan is when it completely changes, completely shifts. And now you have the Democratic Party post-Reagan following the Republican whims. Post-Reagan, Democratic parties have followed the Republicans. The Republicans have been leading this country since Ronald Reagan in their dominant attitude, in their dominant politics. Although Carter marks that change, for sure, it becomes undeniable that this is a reactionary Republican country post-Reagan, and it is perhaps best apparent with every single Democrat that has come post-Ronald Reagan. There's a reason why even Nixon is responsible for the development of the EPA and numerous other things. No such initiatives have taken place on the Republican side since then. Like, think about it. Richard Nixon, at a point, instituted price controls. Obviously, it was a period of tremendous economic instability, but he did that nonetheless. He built the EPA. Like, there's a bunch of shit that he did. I can't think of a Republican president post that era that has ever built upon additional government agencies or built new regulatory agencies rather than destroy the existing ones. And the Democrats have contributed to that as well. Bush made DHS, buddy. I'm talking about regulatory agencies, okay? The Department of Homeland Security is a mutated behemoth that is comprised of all of these other pre-existing agencies that was designed to surveil America's citizens, okay? That's very different. Political eras of the United States. Yeah, New Deal Democratic era, dominated by a coalition of socially conservative Democrats based in the South and economically progressive Democrats based in the greater Rust Belt region, the Sun Belt on the West Coast of the United States. This marks the beginning of the party switch. Liberals in the North and urban cities slowly flip Democratic. In 1969, the present divided government era. I don't think that's correct. That's my assessment is different than this, is what I'm trying to say. I think post-Reagan is the, I guess, if you want to call the FDR, post-FDR, the New Deal Democratic era, I would say post-Reagan is the Reaganomics era, neoliberal, the period of late-stage capitalism, neoliberalization in the United States of America. Maybe you can call it the unitary executive theory era. I don't know. There's many different things that you can say. Yeah. Six-party system describes a system that began in the 1980s, known for in the period which Republicans used a Southern strategy to realign Dixiecrats from the South into party, which began in 64 when Goldwater became the first Republican since Reconstruction to win in the Deep South, although he lost the overall South, and finalized in 1984 when Reagan kept the South permanently Republican. This allowed the party to gain dominant control over the presidency after 1968 or 1980, though dominant control of Congress would remain in Democratic hands because of the Southern seats in Congress remaining a solid Democratic bloc until the Republicans flipped the congressional South in the 1994 Republican Revolution. Because of this realignment, the first half of this party system is heavily dominated by ticket splitting, i.e. Nixon Democrats and Reagan Democrats. Then a second realignment occurred among centrist independent voters in the North and West who supported John B. Anderson and Ross Perot in the Democratic Party from 1996 to 2008, allowing the Democrats to make the presidency competitive. This half of the party system is dominated by polarization. Seventh party system is the populist era. Some political science suggests a new party system, seventh party system, may be emerging in the United States, no, it's not. Donald Trump is a Reaganomics guy through and through. We are absolutely still in the post-Reagan universe. He is an accelerated Reaganist. This marks a big shift in American politics that's coming to its logical end, which inevitably will lead to fascism. Okay, but like fascism in the way that you fully understand it.
On a remarkably underdeveloped economic base. Therefore, the fundamental principle guiding the pivot towards market socialism was the necessity of overcoming material scarcity by rapidly developing the forces of production. The benefits of the market could outweigh the risks so long as the Communist Party maintained a firm grip on the power of the state and prevented the national bourgeoisie from transforming its economic power into political power. By these means, and these means only, could the Communist Party ensure that China would continue the long march down the socialist road, even though it was opening space for markets and private investment.
But rather than engaging seriously with China's historical development, Western Marxism often reduces its trajectory to a simplistic narrative, that Deng Xiaoping forcefully pushed capitalist restoration under the guise of socialist language. But this account merely substitutes moral judgment for materialist analysis, where complex questions, such as labor relations, state policy, and internal contradictions, all become collapsed into vague labels like authoritarianism, which explain very little while foreclosing deeper inquiry. Meanwhile, the successes of actually existing socialism, if Western Marxism identifies any at all, are attributed abstractly to the people, while failures are assigned to the state, producing a one-sided and undialectical account of China's economic development.
Some of the more charitable interpretations within Western scholarship attempt to explain China's development as a hybrid between socialism and capitalism, or a mixed economy, similar to the Scandinavian model. However, this comparison also lacks nuance and obscures fundamental structural differences between these two systems. Much like the vague use of the term authoritarian to equate communism with fascism, the label mixed economy often collapses important distinctions between Western capitalism and socialism with Chinese characteristics into a false equivalence. Under the mixed economy model of the imperial core, welfare states emerged in the post-World War II era as a response to the contradictions of capitalism. The working class would temporarily receive a large portion of the surplus product, but the bourgeois class would continue to control the state and therefore determine the nature of social reform altogether. These economies were deemed mixed insofar as they contained capitalist elements, such as private control over the commanding heights of the economy and state, but socialist insofar as they had universal healthcare, maternity leave, a pension system, and other redistributive policies and mechanisms. In fact, as these progressive reforms were introduced, much of the Western working class and socialist movement began to shift more towards a type of socialist politics that no longer fought for state power, but merely fought for progressive reforms under the bourgeois state.
However, in the People's Republic of China, things are structured differently. Emphasis tends to focus less on the size of the welfare state as a measure of social progress, and much more on the question of who holds political power over the state. As disciplined Marxist-Leninists, the Communist Party of China has always understood that unless the proletariat captured state power and suppressed the political and military might of the ousted counter-revolutionary bourgeoisie, any reform won by the workers was only temporary. If the state remained a dictatorship of capital, the working class would forfeit its political sovereignty, and democracy would become a privilege of the propertied few. Therefore, one of the defining features of the Chinese system is the dictatorship of the proletariat in the form of a one-party state, which allows the Communist Party to prevent...
Bend?
the economic power of capital from transforming into political power. The party maintains its control through aggressive anti-corruption campaigns, people-oriented market regulations, and long-term plans for economic outlook. The Communist Party's dominance over capital and refusal to become corrupted by it has enabled it to direct economic development towards socialist ends rather than the private interests of oligarchs. The mistakes that Western Marxism makes in its analysis ultimately boil down to the concept of the dictatorship of the proletariat. Their analysis fails to recognize the difference between private ownership under capitalism versus partial privatization under socialism, which they mistake as parallel phenomenon. However, the difference is that the capitalist state operates according to the logic of capital, while socialist states, having broken from the influence of capital, can orient themselves towards long-term people-centered development. Sometimes retreats in the development of socialism are necessary. Sometimes mistakes are made. But so long as the dictatorship of the proletariat maintains political control, it has the power to determine when and how to further advance down the socialist road.
Western Marxism often treats state-owned enterprises, in and of themselves, as a defining feature of socialism. State-owned enterprises can provide essential goods and services such as healthcare, infrastructure, and education independently of profitability, and are therefore seen as a mechanism for decommodifying goods and services and distributing them as social rights. From this standpoint, Western Marxist critics argue that the expansion of markets, wage labor, and private capital, alongside the retrenchment of certain welfare guarantees, signals a shift not only towards capitalism, but even neoliberalism. However, this perspective tends to overlook how the state has frequently retained decisive influence through its regulatory authority and control over corporate governance. The four following points highlight the essential difference between the Chinese economic system to that of the West. First, despite privatization, the state continues to maintain control over the commanding heights of the economy. The commanding heights of the economy refers to the strategic sectors upon which the functioning of society depends: finance, energy, telecommunications, transportation, utilities, and defense. These industries form the structural foundation of the economy, and disruption in any one of them can generate cascading effects across the entire system. In the People's Republic of China, the state retains full ownership over core strategic sectors such as defense, nuclear industries, major infrastructure, and banking. Some areas within the commanding heights of the economy have undergone partial marketization, allowing for limited forms of private investment. This does not imply a loss of state control, but that private capital operates within the boundaries set by the state, often restricted to minority shareholder stakes or specific forms of private partnership. For example, in the energy or telecommunications sectors, state-owned enterprises coexist with private firms, but the state ultimately exercises decisive authority through regulation, pricing power, and ownership structures. In some cases, the state holds a majority of the shares of private companies, but in other cases, it maintains effective control through a minority shareholder stake, which still enables it to determine corporate governance and strategic direction. This is similar to capitalist contexts, where figures like Jeff Bezos can control firms like Amazon without a majority share of ownership. Billionaires in the capitalist West learned long ago that they only require about a 40% stake in a company to determine its board of directors.
The Communist Party of China learned from these and similar examples to implement state control over industry while still allowing investment and markets to develop. Enterprises that may appear private on the surface are often embedded within a broader framework of state direction and long-term planning. The key issue regarding socialist development is therefore not simply a question of private versus public ownership in a narrow legal sense, but how the state situates itself as the key decision maker in all areas of the economy.
Yes, it's a cliche at this point, but in China, the government controls capital. In America, and largely in the Western world, capital controls the government. That's it. One party, many changes. Two parties or multiple parties, no changes. You decide.
Enabling it to coordinate.
And for the record, I'm not saying that that's like the best system possible. I'm not saying that at all. Just looking at results.
And plan long-term strategic outlook and adapt to systemic crises like the COVID-19 pandemic.
Second, the state mitigates public losses by privatizing technological research and development. Public attention tends to focus on the small number of tech firms that succeeded and have generated enormous wealth, while overlooking the vast amounts of capital that have been lost in failed ventures. With an estimated 80 to 90% of tech startups failing, high-tech investment is inherently risky and can produce significant losses. Yet technological innovation remains essential to the development of the productive forces, a central goal of the Communist Party. In the People's Republic of China, this conundrum has been managed through a pragmatic division of roles. Rather than exposing public funds to high levels of speculative risk, the state has encouraged the national bourgeoisie to take on this function. However, in order for private investors to accept these risks, the potential for outsized returns must exist. Otherwise, why invest in such risky ventures? The Communist Party has therefore allowed for private investment and the emergence of a billionaire class through an open market in the tech sector. This arrangement reflects a strategic compromise where private capital is permitted to accumulate wealth, but only on the condition that its activity contributes to national development and aligns with broader social objectives, such as developing the forces of.
If the argument is that state ownership and state control over capital equals socialism, I feel like that leaves holes for countries like Saudi Arabia and other petrostates where the state controls almost all aspects of capital and capital serves the coffers of the state. No, absolutely. You're not wrong. Or, I mean, you can literally look at Russia, the Russian Federation. Russia is a petro-capitalist state where I would say the party, or rather the singular person, has tremendous control over capital. The difference is, I don't think Saudi Arabia is as invested in the development or the improvement of the material conditions of all of the people living on Saudi soil, many of which are not even considered Saudi nationals, right? As opposed to China, where the party's focus is proletarian in nature, and the party machine is comprised of those who come from diverse backgrounds from all around the country and have worked all around the country as well. So not all forms of dominance over capital is going to be socialist in nature.
Production. This is why, while banks remain entirely nationalized, major fintech firms such as Tencent operate with access to both domestic and global investment. Paradoxically, this process, while generating significant.
Is people with the rural hukou not able to travel that much different from the workers in Saudi Arabia? Yes, it absolutely is. Because rural hukou system doesn't render travel impossible. Rural hukou system, which is already in the process of being reformed and adjusted to the current needs of current Chinese society, doesn't render their travel impossible. It just shuts their access off to social services outside of where where they live. The hukou system and the way that it works currently is about access to social safety nets, like access to free healthcare, access to free education, things of that nature. I think one of the, hukou system is just to prevent overcrowding in bigger cities. It's more of a problem unique to countries with big rural populations like China. But I would also say that I think China's biggest problem right now isn't even the hukou system at all. I think their biggest problem is that they're turning into the West in some respects, where they have a crisis of like unemployed, educated people. It's without a doubt that the Chinese model has numerous advantages over the American model, but is it better than the Scandinavian model in your opinion? China has substantially more income inequality than the Scandinavian nations, for one. I think they're in the process of solving these crises. So only time will tell. It's not necessarily just a matter of size, but I think it's about how well they can solve these issues. My humble Westerner opinion, the other aspect of Chinese governance that I think is way too heavy-handed and actually, in a weird way, tempers its development in certain forces is its cultural repression, or rather, its tendency to control culture. There is a very heavy-handed approach as far as like sometimes restricting the arts or redirecting the arts in a way to play a very significant role in the development of culture by changing like societal attitudes almost by force sometimes, by saying like, no, you can't do this. You have to do this other thing instead. I think that is part of the reason why, paired up with the fact that they just have never really been that invested in soft power, in my opinion, which, many people will disagree with me on this. I think that it's a huge L. Like their propaganda to the Western world, their propaganda focus to the rest of the world is ass. There is a tremendous room for growth there. And part of the reason why there hasn't been that much, and like the most salient aspect of Chinese culture that people know is Hong Kong cinema, because Hong Kong is, or was a Western enclave. So it didn't have the same like similar social restrictions that mainland China has. Chinese culture is incredible. I mean, you have an endless well of cool, novel things of the Western world that you could straight up showcase. Like, look at how much Japanese culture has been able to dominate the rest of the world, right? There are a lot of artifacts in Japanese culture that unironically come from China. Like, this isn't even that crazy. China was the domineering, imperial force in the region for quite a long time. So many of the things that even Westerners consider to be Japanese culture are actually relics and artifacts from Chinese culture originally. So the fact that Japan has been able to dominate this much, as opposed to China, who has shown no interest whatsoever in developing soft power, is a little silly.
Inequalities in the short term is framed as laying the material foundation for their eventual transcendence. Third, full privatization only exists in smaller markets. Smaller markets, such as retail, light manufacturing, and consumer services, are broadly open to private investment and competition. Rather than centrally managing all production, the state delegates low-stakes sectors to market mechanisms while retaining overall direction of the economy. This arrangement allows the state to focus its resources on the commanding heights of the economy and long-term strategic development. These small market sectors generate modest profits that encourage.
I think China will not be able to break through culturally unless the government lifts its hand off the scale in art. Chinese films are reminiscent of the 1950s American films in a way. No sex, no on-screen violence. No, that's what I'm saying. That was precisely my point.
Encourage entrepreneurship and employment,
Too ridiculous.
but do not concentrate wealth on a scale that empowers the bourgeoisie to meaningfully challenge state authority. Instead, they function in a highly regulated and controlled space for market activity, meeting the everyday needs of consumers, offering employment to workers, while supporting economic dynamism. Importantly, these markets are not free in a classical capitalist sense, as the state thoroughly shapes them through regulation, industrial policy, and macroeconomic planning, using tools such as price controls, credit allocation, licensing, and targeted subsidy. Lastly, it is important to reiterate the centrality of the dictatorship of the proletariat. China's economic model is premised on the continued political dominance of the Communist Party, understood in Marxist-Leninist terms as the institutional expression of a dictatorship of the proletariat. Without this foundation, state power would be captured by capital, enabling the national bourgeoisie to convert its economic influence into political control and shape state policies in the narrow interests of capital.
This was one of the things that Xi Jinping's period will be best known for, which was chopping up. There was a period where I think Chinese bourgeois, national bourgeois class got a little bit too big for its own britches. And he came in and he just chopped it up. Like massive anti-corruption initiatives, a lot of CEOs in prison or, killed, executed by the state.
Seen across much of the Western world.
Disappeared only to return.
But instead,
in a much more diminished role.
Retains authority over the commanding heights of the economy, enforces regulatory discipline, and uses anti-corruption measures to constrain the political power of capital and promote people-centered development. In capitalist societies, stability is often maintained through the consolidation of bourgeois control over the commanding heights of the economy.
My uncle went to prison when Xi came in, Lamau. Damn.
Which translates to
GG's
bourgeois
to your
political
uncle.
power within the state, limiting the political capacity of the working class. As a result, the bourgeois class maintains dictatorial control over the reproduction of the capitalist system itself. But in the People's Republic of China, this logic is reversed. The state controls the commanding heights of the economy, and therefore does not surrender entire key industries to the dictates of capital and the narrow self-interest of a small group of monopolists. This political...
That's a real systemic criticism, though. What prevents a post-Xi world from snapping back to the bourgeoisie? The internal party structure and how people advance through it and how they get to their position of prominence, how they advance to the standing committee. The institution, the party institution itself is supposed to rid people of those sorts of ambitions.
Structure promotes a distinctive form of stability by allowing the state to pursue development strategies on a long-term scale while orienting policy towards broader socialist objectives. Sorely lacking within Western Marxism is any sustained or serious engagement with socialism with Chinese characteristics. Much of this literature either ignores or abstracts away from the historical conditions out of which modern China emerged, the devastation of the century of humiliation, the extreme poverty inherited after 1949, the widespread opium addiction, and the persistent efforts of imperialist powers to contain or disrupt China's socialist development. Western Marxist analyses appear less concerned with understanding socialist construction in practice than with defending an abstract conception of it against actually existing models. They frequently overlook the crucial fact that China remains the only country from the global south to have developed economic and technological capacities that rival the most advanced Western states, while simultaneously raising life expectancy, dramatically improving living standards, and lifting hundreds of millions out of poverty in the span of just a few decades. Rather than deriving their conclusions from empirical outcomes, they often begin from a priori theoretical commitments and interpret China through that lens, producing significant analytical blind spots. For example, this paper criticizes China as capitalist because it has, quote, universal commodity production, unquote. The argument not only ignores the extensive system of social rights provided to Chinese citizens, but also overlooks the fact that commodity production has not become universalized in any comparable way to advanced capitalist economies. For example, gambling, pornography, and even Bitcoin are prohibited in Chinese markets because they don't promote people-centered development. This paper claims that China is capitalist because workers do not directly own and control the means of production.
How do we square China's hostility to labor unions, especially as they shift towards the mixed economy that the video describes? It's literally baked into the Constitution, and it is heavily enforced as well. One recent example is that there was an AI company where a guy literally trained the AI to replace him, and then he sued the company, and then the court system immediately struck down the decision by the company, and it became a new provision that new AI initiatives cannot displace pre-existing labor force. It's kind of saying like, oh, well, there are no minimum wages in Nordic countries. Yeah, there isn't, because the labor system engages in sectoral, the labor union system that they have engages in sectoral bargaining, and therefore it renders a minimum wage to be useless. As a matter of fact, the minimum wage in places like the Scandinavian systems would actually be a depressive force on overall wages, and that's why it's completely unnecessary, you know? Not to get all Dengist here, but black cat, white cat, as long as it catches the rat.
This type of criticism similarly means dramatic improvements in the working and living conditions experienced by the Chinese working class. Since the reform and opening up period, roughly 850 million people have been lifted out of absolute poverty, the most significant poverty reduction in human history. Yet this transformation is rarely given any meaningful weight in Western Marxist analyses. Criticisms of China's environmental reforms follow a similar pattern. They point to China's reliance on coal and rapid industrialization as evidence of its abandonment of environmental initiatives. However, once again, little attention is paid to the country's diversified energy strategy, its significant investments in renewable.
Yeah, analysis that takes a skeptical tone of Chinese development, that refuses to listen to the 5-year plans, what their trajectory looks like, will always look silly a decade later. If you noticed, for the longest time, if you remember, in the green energy side, people that would propagandize against China would always say, oh, dude, they got so much reliance on coal, dude. They're a massive polluter. They got so much environmental pollution. It's like, well, one, it's because they're making shit for you, okay? They're making shit for us. So that's part of the reason why there was a lot of industrial waste and pollution. And two, just wait. And now they don't say that anymore because they've made unbelievable leaps in renewable energy. They are the domineering force in the next wave of energy. They just completely dominate it now.
Energy, or its ongoing efforts to improve ecological conditions. Even the construction of new coal power plants are presented without context, despite the fact that many of these plants are being designed with greater efficiency and emissions reductions technologies such as carbon capture. While these measures are not a complete solution, they do represent meaningful, albeit incremental steps towards lowering overall emissions. Critiques of real estate speculation and housing similarly misrepresent the structure and outcomes of China's housing system. Some Western Marxists portray Chinese housing markets as having been fully privatized and commodified in a manner similar to Western housing markets. But in reality, approximately 90% of Chinese households own their own home, and roughly 70% of Chinese millennials do. Compare this with the West, where only 60% of adults and 30% of millennials own their own home. Overall, Western Marxism's broader political function is in redirecting inquiry away from strategic engagement with existing socialist states and revolutionary traditions. Instead, it tends to privilege theoretical critique over political construction, frequently dismissing communist parties and socialist states as illegitimate while offering no viable alternative pathway to power in advanced capitalist societies. In doing so, it risks functioning less as a framework for anti-capitalist transformation than as an internal critique that remains politically inert. Socialist construction has always involved victories and failures, and any serious Marxist analysis must be capable of studying both if it is to contribute to future praxis. But by rejecting historically successful revolutionary methods while offering no viable alternative, Western Marxism's main contribution is in fragmenting the broader communist movement, and in this way is aligned with the goals of imperialism. Rather than uniting with the historically effective Leninist methods of achieving working-class state power, they interject into socialist discourse with no experience of successful revolution to call their own, to either suggest an alternative method that has consistently ended in failure or completely reinvent the wheel. Once again, as Michael Parenti observes, the pure socialist ideological anticipations remain untainted by existing practice. They do not explain how the manifold functions of a revolutionary society would be organized, how external attack and internal sabotage would be thwarted, how bureaucracy would be avoided, scarce resources allocated, policy differences settled, priorities set, and production and distribution conducted. Instead, they offer vague statements about how the workers themselves will directly own and control the means of production and will arrive at their own solutions through creative struggle. In this sense, Western Marxism maintains a posture of radical critique while avoiding engagement with the problem of political power itself. Revolutionary politics, a dictatorship of the proletariat, or communist organizing are therefore frequently dismissed, while existing socialist states are treated as deviations from a more perfect ideal. The result is a form of critique that can endlessly interpret the world without developing a coherent strategy to actually change it. Within Western Marxism, there are those who maintain the illusion that they are carrying out the revolutionary tradition of Marxism by reading and promoting the Frankfurt School at university. There are also more sober analyses of those who admit—
Interesting that you guys said this guy was a Trotskyist, famously the inventor of the term racism, to render debate impossible.
to the fact that Marxism has effectively become neutered of its revolutionary content in the Western world. This perspective maintains that the proliferation of non-revolutionary Marxism and its retreat into the academy is the result of failed socialist revolutions in the West. However, Gabriel Rockhill—
I don't agree. I will say this much. This aspect of it, I mean, I understand where he's coming from, but I think it's not systemic critique to say that, like, the reason why Western Marxism is an unbelievable failure is because it's disorganized, far too idealistic, far too critical of existing socialist transitional states that are trying to do their very best in relation to their own material conditions and their period of development. All of that stuff is true, but I think the reason as to why Western Marxism has been an abject failure is because the imperial apparatus has eviscerated any sort of revolutionary attempt successfully and have rendered even class consciousness to be a forethought. There has been a tremendous amount of mystification of class politics in this country. We have so effectively neutered any kind of revolutionary movement historically, and at times, not even through psyops, but through direct military action. This has also been an ever-present threat on attempts towards revolutionary politics in Latin America as well, many of which have tried to develop some kind of socialist tendency or communist tendency by way of reform, which has been demonstrably a failure. It's unfortunately, the most resilient form of like revolutionary or the most resilient form of revolutions have almost always come in periods of war, with the only exception being, I guess, the Cuban Revolution, which ironically enough wasn't even a communist revolution in its inception and took shape into a communist one after.
Who Paid the Pipers of Western Marxism offers an important intervention into this assumption by pointing out that Western Marxism did not entirely result from the absence of successful revolution. Revolutions frequently fail, but this does not render revolutionary movements obsolete. Instead,
Rockhill maintains that the real distortion of Marxism in the Western world came from capitalist ownership and control over intellectual production. As Marxism left the streets and factories and became further entrenched with the bourgeois academy, it was progressively reconfigured through an ongoing synthesis with liberalism, post-structuralism, Freud, Heidegger, and a whole host of eclectic theories which tended to undermine rather than develop the revolutionary consciousness or power of the working class. At best, critical theory has served to inform some of the political practice of social democratic parties, although if questioned on this relationship, critical theorists and social democrats alike will be hard-pressed to articulate any direct or meaningful connection between the two. This disjuncture helps explain why, when social democratic or left-leaning parties do enter government, they frequently lack coherent frameworks for transforming capitalist state structures in practice. Meanwhile, Leninism, arguably the most politically consequential development of Marxist theory, has been increasingly marginalized, reframed, or rendered theoretically suspect. The result has not only been a shift in ideas.
I mean, think about it this way. For Westerners, one of the most consequential thinkers of anti-imperialist thought in the West is Noam Chomsky. And this is even before we knew about, what the he was doing with Jeffrey Epstein, right? Written extensively on this stuff. And he was anti-Lenin, which was something that I always found to be in poor taste. Now, I'm not going to sit there and be like, oh my God, Chomsky was anti-Lenin, anti-anarchist vindicated or anything like that. Oh, Parenti vindicated. I think you can read both. But yeah, that is like if your worldview is anchored by anarcho-syndicalism, you're going to have a hard time coming up with these solutions.
But a systematic depoliticization of Marxism within the dominant institutions of knowledge production. In a world that is seeing such major transformation,
Chomsky was anti-Lenin, but he was still pro-Cuba and anti-NATO. We can have nuance. They're true.
At the global scale, from the NATO war against Russia, the genocide in Palestine, the US war in Iran, and the geopolitical rise of China, a rediscovery of Lenin is more timely than ever. His theory of imperialism, which focuses on the expansion of finance capital, is crucial to understanding the context of de-dollarization, the most significant geopolitical and
maybe Leninism isn't necessary in the US because Marxism by Marx is based on a Western European and American trajectory. No, Leninism is always necessary.
Economic shift of our current conjuncture. Furthermore, Lenin provides an ideological basis for interpreting the constitution and program of the Communist Party of China, which allows us to interpret the history and function of the party within the philosophical and ideological framework through which it developed. In short, the systematic marginalization of Leninism in the Western Academy is producing a systematic underdevelopment of thought and understanding towards China. From a Marxist-Leninist perspective, socialism is not an abstract ideal to be measured against existing reality, but a historical process grounded in the development of the forces of production, proletarian political consciousness, and the power of the Communist Party. If socialism is understood as a horizon, Z, then revolutionary praxis is not about a leap to its immediate realization, but the strategic movement from A to B to C while preserving and expanding the material capacities necessary for further transformation. History is not traversed in a single rupture, but through a long march in which advances, reversals, errors, setbacks, and adaptations are inevitable. What matters is whether the working class retains and consolidates political power through a dictatorship of the proletariat capable of steering the direction of society down the socialist road. From this standpoint, the historical trajectory of the People's Republic of China is not a deviation from socialism, but one of its most consequential contemporary expressions. Whatever contradictions remain, its sustained capacity to eliminate mass poverty, expand technological development, improve material conditions for hundreds of millions, among many other great achievements, constitutes an empirical reality that any serious socialist analysis ought to confront. While China continues to undergo rapid development, the political horizon in the advanced capitalist world is also shifting, only in the opposite direction. Increasing numbers of young people are entering into a social order marked by declining living standards, extreme concentration of wealth, ecological nihilism, and permanent geopolitical instability. Many youth recognize that a narrow elite of oligarchs exercises disproportionate control over all of our political and economic life. For these young people growing up under these circumstances today, being anti-capitalist is no longer a moral or ideological conviction, but a survival strategy in a world that doesn't seem to give a damn about their collective economic condition. This emerging clarity does not automatically produce revolutionary consciousness, but it does open space for it. And throughout this process of building class consciousness, many are looking to gain an understanding of alternative models of development, like the model of market socialism in China. However, the real challenge moving forward is not simply to convince Westerners to learn from China, but to prepare them for the task of achieving state power. The question of state power must be recovered in socialist discourse: how it is built, how it is sustained, and how it is used to transform social relations in practice. While the objective conditions for revolution are past ripe, the subjective revolutionary consciousness of the masses still needs to continue to develop. This is why Marxism-Leninism needs to continue to agitate, educate, and organize the masses so that one day they can stamp out the dictatorship of capital, render Western Marxism obsolete, and join China in the long march down the socialist road.
Yeah, that was a pretty good video from Red Pen. I liked it.